You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. And welcome back to another episode of the Spot Up Pod. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you've been watching the Spurs, you know that there haven't been many games this past week, so I want to begin by going over their last two games from the past week against the Atlanta Hawks and then against the Portland Trail Blazers. So let's begin by going back to Thursday, December 19th. Spurs are at home hosting the Atlanta Hawks for the first time this season. The Spurs were favored by 1 against Atlanta, and this game went all the way to overtime where the Spurs got their first overtime victory of the season by defeating the Hawks in overtime by 7 points. This game was pretty close throughout. The Spurs built a 10-point lead early. The Hawks built an 11-point lead early as well. But then from there, both teams kind of kept it very close, back and forth throughout the rest of the game. The Spurs, weren't able to get the win in crunch time. They actually had to go to overtime, but they did make some stops against Trae Young on 2 final possessions. Victor Wembanyama was able to contest Young's shots, and so the game did go to overtime. And then in overtime is where the Spurs took control. Wemby and Chris Paul both took control there in overtime for the Spurs. Wemby had a big night on this game where he ends up with 42 points. He makes 7 threes in this game. He also records 6 rebounds, 5 assists, 4 blocks, and 2 steals. And for Wemby, this was his third 40 points or more game of his career. So again, the third time now he's hit 40 or more in his early career. And he had an incredible play. I think it was in the fourth quarter where it looked like he had nowhere to go. He throws the ball off the backboard, and then he ends up grabbing it and dunking it, in midair. And so that was one of the highlight plays from Wemby, and I'll continue to mention Wemby here in the next game. Devin Vassell got his first start of the season, and so he ends up coming up big for the Spurs. He ends up with 23 points on the night. He went 5 of 7 from three-point range. So Vassell, I'll talk about a little bit later, is back in the starting lineup. Jeremy Sohan also still in the starting lineup. Ends up with 20 points and 8 rebounds. But one thing he did, even though Trae Young had a good game statistically, he had a lot of assists, he had a lot of points. Sohan really made him work for a lot of those points and assists. Just really chased him around a lot of different screens. Just was all over him throughout the floor. Chris Paul made a remark after the game where he said, for one possession, Sohan was on the bench down in the fourth quarter, and Young ended up hitting a 3, and he told the coaching staff, get Sohan back in the game, like he needs to be on Trae Young. And so again, Sohan had a good game defensively there, guarding Trae Young. And then Chris Paul came through big for the Spurs in both the fourth quarter and overtime. He only ends up with 12 points, but he shot perfectly on the night, 4 of 4 from the floor, and he scored 10 of his 12 points in crunch time and overtime. He had 2 big threes in crunch time, and then in overtime he hit a 3 as well. There, I think he got fouled, or one of those possessions he hit a 3 and then he got fouled. So again, Chris Paul came through for the Spurs as he's been doing for them in crunch time so far this season. And so that was the Spurs' 11th crunch time game against the Hawks there. And that means that the Spurs, by getting that win, they ended up improving to 8-3 in crunch time, making them second best in the NBA in crunch time winning percentage. So that's one thing the Spurs have continued to do very well so far, is get these wins in crunch time, with obviously guided by leadership, like by a player like Chris Paul, also having a veteran like Harrison Barnes on the team. But then also the young players have really come through. I wrote a piece about just their ranks, the young players such as Victor Wembanyama, Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson, who else, Sohan. So yeah, there's also the young players are starting to show more winning success there in crunch time for the Spurs. The second game for the Spurs took place on Saturday. This was against the Portland Trail Blazers. This was the third time the Spurs have played the Blazers. San Antonio was expected to win this one. They were favored by 6.5. And basically, this is actually one of the first true, I would say, blowouts of the season for the Spurs, where they basically controlled throughout the entire game. Portland had a very small lead of 2 points early in the first quarter. That from there, San Antonio controlled the rest of the way. The Spurs really blew the game open in the second quarter when they opened up a 16-point lead. They ended up taking that lead into halftime, and then in the third quarter and the fourth, they maintained their lead. They ended up getting the lead as high as 26 on Portland. And basically, by like 7 minutes, maybe in the fourth quarter, most of the starters were gone. They weren't going to play anymore, and so the bench unit came in and took over for the rest of the game. And so the Spurs ended up winning very comfortably by 20 points. They actually that 26-point lead was just notable because the last time the Spurs led by 26 was on November 4th against the Clippers in LA, and the Spurs ended up losing that game. So they're actually now 1-1 when leading by 26. I know that's just a random factoid, I guess, or fact. Anyway, for the Spurs, again, they don't really get a lot of blowout wins this season. They've had 3 now. That was their 3rd win by 18 or more points. But the other 2, the first one was against the Jazz back on Halloween night, and it was a game 2 where Utah led early, and then the Spurs came back and blew them out of the second half. And then their other blowout win was a 20-point win against the Kings earlier this season, where that really didn't open up until the 4th quarter. It was pretty much close throughout, and then the Spurs really opened it up against the Kings there in the 4th quarter. And so just some notable players from this game was basically Wemby here. I mean, a lot of players filled in, produced some good numbers as well, but Wemby really stood out here. So he ends up with 30 points on the night, as well as 10 blocks, so a unique double-double. The 10 blocks that he recorded against Portland tied his career high in blocks. As part of his 30 points, he also got to the free throw line 11 times, and he made 10 free throws. So again, he tied his season high with 10 made free throws, continuing to get himself to the line. And then something that the Spurs' PR staff noted, Jordan Howenstein, one of the Spurs' PR members, he noted that Wemby was the 15th fastest player to record 200 made threes in his NBA career. And basically that's faster than Steph Curry, James Harden, and Ray Allen, all getting to 200 made threes. So again, that's just a notable mark there by Wemby, considering he's a 7'5" player recording some of these numbers, these 3-point numbers. He shot well from 3. He made 4 of 8 threes in that game as well against Portland. So again, that was one of the Spurs' first true blowouts there in that win Saturday against the Blazers. So now that the Spurs have completed 28 games, let's just kind of get a picture of where they're at. And I do want to note that I'm recording this Sunday afternoon. So a lot of games will take place. So maybe some of these standings and numbers will change by the time you hear this. So the Spurs are 15-13 through 28 games. They're 2 games now above 500. That win against Portland moved them from 11th out west to 9th. And the reason why that happened was because the Phoenix Suns on Saturday evening lost that night. And so right away, I mean, you lose one game and you can quickly, move around in this Western Conference playoff seed. This just shows you how kind of bunched up the West is in the playoff race. The Spurs are only 1 game behind the 5th place Lakers, who are 16-12. And then, like I said, they're only half a game in front of Phoenix, who are currently 11th out of the play-in picture at 14-13. So again, you just want to, if you're the Spurs, you want to try to keep your wins above 500, and you're going to be able to stay in that playoff picture with some of these other Western Conference teams. That's how close these standings are right now, between basically like 11 through 5. In that range. With these 2 games, the Spurs have stayed the same offensively. Last week when I recorded, they were still 17th offensively. They're still 17th today. Defensively, they did make an improvement because that it was really that game against Portland where they held the Blazers to 94 points. They are now 4-0 when holding an opponent below 100 points. But what that did was that brought their ranking defensively from 19th down to 16th, so basically right below league average. And then their net rating overall has stayed the same at ranked 17th. So that's the Spurs through 28 games. Let's keep going. All right, so now we're going to go through 3 topics in this episode. The first topic is going to be on this latest De'Aaron Fox trade rumor. So what happened was, just a quick little summary here, is that on Saturday, 2 writers from The Athletic, Sam Amick and Anthony Slater, dropped a piece, basically not saying that Fox is, on the trade market, that the Kings are trying to move him, or he's asked for a trade. None of that's happening. It's more so that yes, the Kings have had a disappointing start to the season, and Fox has not yet signed a contract extension with Sacramento. So it's just more so about starting to take notice of that, about the fact that the Kings aren't headed in the right direction, and Fox may not want to be at Sacramento long term if the team's not going to start being more successful than where they're at right now, which is I think 12th out west, and they're a few games below 500. And so basically, the reason why I bring this up on a Spurs podcast is because the Spurs' name did get mentioned a few paragraphs into this article, where Slater and Amick report that the Spurs, according to their league sources, their league sources that they talk to, that the Spurs are positioning themselves to pursue Fox if he does become available in the future. So again, that's where the Spurs get mentioned here. And it's not just the Spurs. They also mentioned if word comes out that Fox either demands a trade or the Kings are shopping him, then other teams would also obviously get into these trade discussions as well. But again, the reason why I want to bring up the Spurs' name, because they are actually mentioned here in this article. Now, I don't think that Fox would demand a trade this season, nor do I, or I don't think the Kings are going to look to move him this season. And the reason why is because he's waiting to see if he can make the All NBA team. He made it back in the 2023 season, third team All NBA. And what that does is that if he were to make it this season, let's say by April, the NBA teams, all NBA teams come out, he makes first, second, or third team. Well, then that qualifies him now to sign a 5-year supermax extension with the Kings. And again, you can only sign that supermax with the team that you're with, after your rookie scale deal. And so basically, the Sacramento is the team that drafted him, and he's been playing with Sacramento for 8 years now. And so the Kings are the only team that can offer him that deal. He can't get traded and then, make all NBA and then sign a supermax with somebody else. That's just not how the CBA works. So again, that's why I think that it's very unlikely that he would get traded this season. Again, I think that he's going to wait to see it. It's in his financial benefit to see, does he make all NBA, and if he does, well then obviously the Kings probably don't want to lose him, so obviously they'd probably offer him that supermax in the summer, and then a lot of these this whole article kind of just becomes mute. What would happen though? Let's just say that he did make an All NBA team this year. Then the Kings in the offseason, they could offer him a 5-year supermax. If he were to sign that supermax, then he cannot be traded for 1 calendar year. So let's say he signs, July 7th, 2025. Well, then he cannot be traded for a whole year, which is July 7th, 2026. So again, I think that it's very unlikely that he would get traded this season. But let's say now that Fox doesn't make All NBA, and then I think that becomes more interesting because now he's on the final year of his deal coming into next year. And so the Kings have to start looking at, are they going to lose him for nothing if he doesn't sign a contract extension with them? And so that's where the Spurs and other teams can get really more aggressive in terms of calling the Kings and trying to figure out some Fox deals. What do I want to mention here about some? And I did write all this up on my Substack, thespotupshot.com. So I do encourage you to listen there. I went into way more details. I'm just kind of giving a quick summary of that article here. So I talked about Fox and why All NBA is important. So just regarding his contract, Fox is making $35 million this season, which is the max. He signed a rookie max extension with the Kings back in 2020. And then next year he's going to make $37 million. So again, that's where his current contract's at for teams that are trying to pursue him. If they do, let's just say that he did demand a trade, right? So like obviously the King, he starts asking for a trade, and the Kings start shopping around. It's the Spurs could find a deal. They have the contracts to make this work. They could do something like Keldon Johnson and Zach Collins, and then they have a bunch of draft picks. They have 12 first round picks from now until 2031. Plus they have a few pick swaps as well. Again, I don't think this one would happen, but and then the Kings probably wouldn't want Collins because he has this year plus next year on his deal. So the Spurs are probably giving more picks, not only just to acquire Fox, but then also to take on Collins' contract. One player who cannot work in this deal is Harrison Barnes, because he was recently traded from Sacramento to San Antonio. So Barnes cannot go back to the Kings in any kind of trade unless he first goes to a third team, gets waived, and then maybe he has a chance of signing back with the Kings. So again, there's no way to include Barnes, who has a big salary in this type of a deal, back to Sacramento. So again, I don't think that this season it's even worth looking into a deal right now. I think it's about looking into the summertime. So now let's go to that scenario where Fox doesn't make an All NBA team this season, and now either he asks for a trade or the Kings know they're probably going to lose him because he won't sign a contract extension, so they start shopping him around. Now this is where the Spurs need to start getting ready here if they really have interest in pursuing Fox, and plus the Spurs might, especially in the summer, they could have vacancy at the point guard position. Both Chris Paul and Trey Jones are going to be unrestricted free agents, so there's no guarantee that they could have Stephon Castle become the point guard next year, for the future, or they could still have Castle be more so like a combo guard like he's been doing this year, because he's shown he can play either role very well. But again, in this scenario, let's talk about the Spurs pursuing Fox in the offseason in the event that he doesn't make an All-NBA team. So here, contracts-wise, the Spurs could still get a deal done, like I mentioned, with Keldon Johnson and Zach Collins. Now, if it's in the summertime, this deal, it's not as bad for the Kings taking on Collins' contract, because now he's in the final year of his deal. He's an expiring contract. So the Spurs don't have to give as many assets away because they're having to include Collins' contract in this deal. But there's also going to be, if word gets out that Fox demands a trade, or that the Kings are shopping him around, there's also going to be other teams coming getting in these trade negotiations, and so that's where the Spurs will have to see exactly what is their limit, because other teams could start offering younger players who are on their rookie scale contracts, and that's something where the Spurs have to ask that question. If the Kings were to ask for someone like Jeremy Sohan, a young player on his rookie scale contract, would they be willing to include him, or is it a no automatically? So like that's the kind of negotiations the Spurs have to look at, and also also the picks will be very important. In the offseason, the Spurs can beat a lot of different teams' packages with first round picks, but how many picks is too much, for the Spurs in these different scenarios. So again, I think that the big thing to watch with this Fox rumor is more so for the summertime. If he does not make All NBA, then that's where it gets really interesting. Does he ask for a trade, or do the Kings start looking to move him because they know they could lose him the following summer for nothing? But again, that's just a quick wrap up of the De'Aaron Fox trade rumor. And again, I do encourage you to read what I wrote over on the spotupshot.com. For topic number 2, this is something I've been writing about. I wrote about this on Friday. It's called Taking Care of Business. And what this topic's about is mainly how the Spurs this year so far through 28 games, they've done a really good job of beating the teams that they're supposed to beat on paper. And also, basically having a lot of surprise losses where, they're not prepared mentally to play these teams that are below 500 and they end up losing these games. They're actually playing, they have a really, really good record against these types of teams. So right now, the Spurs are 9-2 as favorites. So again, in the 11 games they've been favored, they're 9-2. That's already more than last season. I think the total last season, they were only favored in 9 games. Right now, it's already at 11, and they're only 28 games to the season. Against the teams that are 500 and below, or that are below 500, the Spurs are really doing really good here. They're 11-3 against these teams. So again, 11-3 against the below 500 teams. So obviously, a lot of these teams are in the Eastern Conference. These below 500 teams, and so the Spurs haven't played a lot of them as well. So again, these are potential wins that could be on the board for the Spurs as long as, like I said, they take care of business. They don't underestimate these teams. And they're not playing their best basketball against these clubs. So the teams that they still got to play are the Wizards once. They still got to play the Charlotte Hornets twice, the Toronto Raptors twice, the Philadelphia 76ers twice, although Philly is one of those teams that context needs to be added where, yes, they have a bad record, but when they're pretty much healthy with Joel Embiid, Paul George, and Tyrese Maxey, they can be a formidable foe. And so the Spurs, we're going to get to see how the Spurs shape up against them on Monday when the Spurs travel to Philly to play the Sixers. So they have 2 games against Philly. The Spurs have 2 games against the Brooklyn Nets, who have been better than expected this year. They have 2 games against the Pistons, who have been better than expected. They have 1 more game against the Chicago Bulls. And again, the Bulls are one of those teams who are kind of right below 500. And we already saw that the Bulls actually went into San Antonio and beat the Spurs. So obviously, the Bulls aren't an easy win for San Antonio. They've already showed them they can beat them. They also had the Indiana Pacers twice this season, and the Pacers are barely below 500, and that's going to be a unique game because both games will be in France in January. And then the Spurs have 1 more game against the Hawks, and the Hawks barely became under 500 because when I wrote this article on Friday, the Hawks were a 500 team. Now they're below 500. And we obviously saw that it took overtime for the Spurs to defeat the Hawks. So obviously, the Hawks aren't an easy win as well. There's not really a lot of bad teams out west. The only ones are the New Orleans Pelicans. The Spurs play them 2 more times this year. 2 or 3 more times. I got to look at the number. Anyway, I think it's 3 more times because they're a division rival. Anyway, so the Spurs are going to play the Pelicans as well, and the Pelicans too. When they start getting fully healthy or start getting a lot of their players back, they can be like the Sixers, a tougher team on paper than maybe what the record shows. The Spurs will play Portland 1 more time in April. Obviously, that should be a game like the Spurs showed on Saturday, a very winnable game. And then against the Kings have actually beat the Spurs once this season. I know the Spurs have won the other 2. And so again, the Kings aren't an easy out either to pick up an automatic win. So again, that's kind of the main thing here. Main topic here was that the Spurs have been doing a good job of taking care of business against the teams they should beat on paper. And so basically, if they do that, there's a good chance that they could get about 14-15 wins this year alone just against these specific teams. So you add that to the wins they already have, and you're talking already like in that high 30s mark, maybe even early 40s number there when they still have to play all the other good teams out west. And so that's about 35% of their season still left to play these below 500 teams. So again, that's kind of what I wanted to mention here was how the Spurs so far through 28 games have been doing a pretty good job against the teams that they should beat on paper. All right, so now for the final topic, I want to discuss what the full healthy rotation is looking like so far through 2 games. So I know that going back to last week, when the Spurs did this past week, where they actually started their new lineups because they have a full healthy roster. It kind of I spent so much time on the arguing the Sohan versus Castle lineup, and then all of a sudden the Spurs come out with the lineup that they probably wanted to start at the beginning of the season had Devin Vassell not been injured to start the year. So that lineup is Chris Paul, Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes, Jeremy Sohan, and Victor Wembanyama. So again, the Spurs have started this group in the last 2 games. Mitch Johnson was asked about this. Was this the lineup you all wanted, in the offseason before, finding out Vassell was injured? And he basically didn't say, this is specifically the lineup they wanted, but he said, basically like that was the favorite in terms of lineup, odds. That was the favorite to probably start the season. And so now we're getting to see what this lineup looks like. The data is very small because, again, a lot of these players haven't been healthy in the same game for a long time this season. They've only been available, these 5 players in the same lineup, for 72 possessions per cleaningtheglass.com. They are obviously, it's a small sample size, very small sample size, but their numbers look really good. They're a plus 33.5 points per 100, this lineup. They're scoring 122 points per 100 on offense and holding the opponent to 88.7 points per 100 defensively. So, only playing in 72 possessions, that's not enough to qualify for a percentile in terms of, where does that rank? So like the other lineup with Castle had 309 possessions together, whereas the other lineup with Sohan and Julian Champagny had 200 possessions together. So again, once we start to see that, once it gets close to like that 150, 200 possession mark, that'll be a better estimate of how exactly this lineup is. I'm projecting to show that they are. And Coach Johnson did mention that the Spurs do want to give this lineup time. They're gonna run this lineup out there for a few for multiple games. They want to see whether it's good data or bad data. They want to just see what does this lineup look like. And so obviously that's the new starting lineup that the Spurs are going to be going forward with. So we'll continue to track how they're doing. The bench lineup that has come out, it has mostly players that we kind of expected off the bench, except for one surprise. So Trey Jones is the backup point guard. Stephon Castle is at the shooting guard spot, kind of like that combo guard spot. Julian Champagny now has moved to the bench, so he's running the 3. Keldon Johnson is playing that small ball 4 role, just like another wing out there. But the surprise in this for 2 games with the bench group has not been it hasn't been Zach Collins there as the backup 5 like he had been for most of the season. It's now Charles Bassey. So Bassey has done a really good job, if you've been watching the games, where he's coming in and bringing a lot of energy on both ends of the floor. Offensively, he's rolling, he's cutting, he's attacking the offensive glass. Some days in just a few minutes, he's putting up doubles really quickly, crashing the glass and scoring near the rim. He doesn't really take any outside shots. He's just stays very energetic. And then defensively, there's some games where he's getting more blocks. Not a lot. Let's just say Wemby has like two blocks in a game or 3 blocks. Bassey might end up like 4 blocks in that game. So there have been some games defensively too where he's really shined as well in protecting the rim and really helping out with some different help blocks. And now because of that, Zach Collins hasn't got into the game in these last 2 games, and that's just interesting to watch because if we note just regarding contract wise, Zach is making $16.7 million this season, and then next year he's under contract for $18 million. And so again, Bassey's definitely earned that role. If that's what the coaching staff has been seeing, the numbers are also showing some really good data in the eye test as well. But you have the 4th highest paid player basically not playing it. So basically, if you're not going to use Zach in games this year, you obviously want to start looking. Can they move him via trade? And then that's where it becomes a tough question for the coaching staff: is do they give Zach minutes to maybe try to increase his trade value, or do they just continue with Bassey? Obviously, because that's for the better in terms of the team and success. And so that's just kind of a question, because obviously if Zach's just sitting there, teams aren't going to try to pursue him for a trade, at all. If he's not even getting out there on the floor. So again, that's just an interesting question, something to watch. Is how long does Zach stay there on the bench despite Bassey playing so well? Regarding data with this lineup, it's a very, 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 very small sample size. So they have only been out on the floor together, these 5 players, for 23 possessions per cleaning the glass. Again, just 23 possessions, but they too have been pretty good in terms of the numbers. Plus 33.5 points per 100. Offensively struggling, 104.3 points per 100, but defensively, a monster, 70.8 points per 100. Again, you really can't take too much from a 23 possession sample size. But like the starting lineup, I do want to see what these numbers look like. After maybe like 100 possessions together, what does this quintet look like of these 5 players off the bench? All right, so now as we look to the schedule ahead for this week, I'm gonna basically just go over the games for this coming week. I don't know exactly when I'll record a new podcast. It might either be on Monday, the 30th of December, or it could be after the New Year. So again, I'm not quite sure when I'll be recording, but I just want to go over these, preview these next 4 games for this coming week for the Spurs. So let's go to Monday. The Spurs are going to be on the road at Philly. They are going to play the Sixers for the first time this year. That's on Monday, December 23rd. Then on Wednesday, the Spurs get a Christmas game. They're going to play Christmas morning against the New York Knicks in New York, in New York. So that's on Christmas Day. on the 25th. Then on Friday, the 27th, the Spurs are still on the East Coast. They are playing at Brooklyn, so they're playing the Nets for the first time. And then on Sunday, they wrap up this 4-game road trip on the road still against the Minnesota Timberwolves in Minnesota on December 29th. And obviously, in the last game, Minnesota, beat the Spurs pretty well there in that last game in San Antonio. So maybe the Spurs are looking for some revenge. I'm not too sure. We'll see how they come out again in these next 4 East Coast games. So as far as a prediction for how I think the Spurs are going to perform in these games, I think they're going to go 2-2. So I have them beating the Sixers. Again, we'll see. Philly, it wouldn't be a surprise if Philly ends up winning that game. I have them losing to the Knicks. I have them beating the Nets, and then I have them losing to the Wolves. And so again, I think that they'll go 2-2. And again, I don't know exactly if I'll record on Monday the 30th of January, or if I'll be recording again after the New Year. All right, so now as I start wrapping up this episode, I do want to say, I do want to mention, if you'd like to, if you want to visit the spotupshot.com, we have a lot of content up there right now, just kind of reviewing what was written up there on this past week. So on Tuesday, I looked at the trade deadline approaching for the Spurs and other NBA teams in terms of, I looked at, how far are different teams from below the tax, below the first apron to the second apron, and then what are the limitations if they are below, hitting the first apron or second apron, and then also, how does that involve them in terms of being a potential trade partner with the Spurs? So that's over on spotupshot.com. I also wrote about Julian Champagnie and Harrison Barnes being very efficient this year as corner shooters, and how they are responsible for a big chunk of the Spurs' corner threes this season. So again, there's a feature there on Champagnie and Barnes shooting the corner 3. Of course, after every game, I write my analysis. So there's obviously the analysis over the Hawks game and the Blazers game. And then I also had a piece where I talked more in depth about the Spurs taking care of business against the teams they're supposed to beat on paper. I looked at some different crunch time ranks for different Spurs players. Like when I wrote that piece on Friday, Chris Paul was 3rd overall in the NBA in crunch time assist. Wemby was in the top 10 for rebounds, for blocks, for made free throws. So Wemby's obviously, this is showing how the Spurs players are ranking compared to some of their other NBA other NBA players out there in crunch time. And I also looked at some usage data for the new lineups that the Spurs have been putting out there with the new starting 5 and the new bench unit. And then, of course, on Saturday, I wrote about in more detail that Fox trade rumor that came out. I kind of gave my take on it, and and looked at that and with more detail and some numbers, salary wise, and things like that. So again, I do encourage you all to continue to visit the spotupshot.com and please subscribe whenever you visit that site. That way you can get my new articles and podcasts and videos all in your inbox as soon as they are written and published. And then obviously you can tell by my sweater here that it's obviously Christmas week this year. So I do want to say have a Merry Christmas, and if I don't record before the New Year, have a Happy New Year. And I just wanted to say this, just a big thank you to a lot of you all who have been supporting me in this new adventure. So if you all have been following my work for a long time, you know that I used to write for ProjectSpurs.com for over 10 years. I was over at Project Spurs covering the Spurs. I launched this Substack a year ago, mainly just to focus on NBA teams. So I was still writing with Project Spurs on the staff there, and I was only I wasn't really going too much with this one. It was only dedicated to other NBA teams, not the Spurs. Then in April, right before the season ended, I started to start writing about the Spurs on the Substack, the spotupshot.com, and then in August, I made the full switch. With this season beginning, I made the entire switch. I'm no longer with Project Spurs, so I am now. This is all my Spurs work is now here over on the. My written work is on the spotupshot.com. I do thank you all for listening to my new podcast, the Spot Up Pod. Obviously, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for subscribing. Whether you're, it's on Apple, it's on Spotify, wherever it's at, YouTube, wherever I publish the podcast. And of course, I have launched my video series over on YouTube called the Spot Up Pod. So again, all my videos for this episode and all the other episodes are up there. So again, I do want to thank you all for supporting me in these first few months of my new adventure of launching the Spot Up Shot and the Spot Up Pod. And of course, I'm looking very forward to 2025. What's in store? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spot Up Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.